Colleagues, good afternoon. I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 72, the House of Commons Standing Committee on Government Operations and Estimates, also known as the mighty OGGO, the only committee that matters. Pursuant to the order of reference adopted by the House of Commons on Monday, May 29, 2023, the committee is meeting on the study of the Supplementary Estimates A 2023-2024, Vote 1A, under the Department of Public Works and Government Services. Before we introduce our guests, colleagues, I have something new, if I could have everyone's attention. I have a special request from our interpreters just regarding our headphones. A couple items, please keep them away from the microphones. It's causing bad feedback. Please do not drop them, and do not do what a lot of us do when we're bored, to spin them around. So please just be advised, I guess it is causing issues for our valued translators. So thank you for that, colleagues. We welcome back our Parliamentary Budget Officer, Mr. Yves Giroux, honorary member of OGGO, is back with us again. Thank you for joining us, and also Ms. Van der Wees, our estimates expert. Mr. Giroux, you have an opening statement for us?
Chair. So, good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Thank you for the invitation to appear before you today. We're pleased to be here to discuss our report on the Supplementary Estimates A 2023-24, which was published on May 30th, 2023. With me today, I have our lead analyst on estimates and on the report, Caitlin Van der Wees. The government's Supplementary Estimates A for 2023-24 outline $21.9 billion in incremental spending. Parliament's approval is required for $20.5 billion. Statutory authorities, for which the government has Parliament's approval to spend via other legislation, are forecast to increase by a total of $1.4 billion. Roughly one-fifth, or $4.4 billion of spending is for 15 Budget 23 measures. Most notably, this includes $2.5 billion to the Department of Health to improve health care for Canadians. Je vais maintenant poursuivre en français.
I'll now be speaking French. More than half of the proposed spending in the supplementary estimates, roughly $13 billion, relates to the negotiation and resolution of Indigenous claims. Including these supplementary estimates, the total proposed year-to-date budgetary authorities are $454.8 billion, which represents an increase of $11.5 billion, or 2.6%, compared with the estimates to date for the preceding year. This is generally consistent with the spending growth forecast in Budget 2023. To support parliamentarians in their scrutiny of Budget 2023 implementation, we have prepared and published tracking tables that list all budget initiatives, the planned spending amounts, and the corresponding legislative funding authority. These tables are available on our website and will be updated over the course of the year as the government brings forward its legislative agenda. Caitlin and I would be pleased to answer any questions you might have regarding our estimates, analysis, or any other PBO work. Thank you.
We'll start with Mr. Chambers, please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Welcome back, Mr. Giroux, Ms. Van der Wees. It's always good to have you at committee. And appreciate much of the work that your office does to support parliamentarians. I know those of us who do not have large departments or staffs rely on your work on a regular basis, and it's very high quality. You mentioned in the supplementary estimates, and I know we're spending more per year on debt servicing costs than we have in the past, almost double, in fact. I'm a little nervous about the projections that the government has for debt servicing costs because there was a surprise interest rate increase announcement last week. And I believe the government's projections are that rates were supposed to have come down by the end of the year. I haven't been able to find the average interest rate that the government expects to roll over or issue its debt at for this year coming up. I'm wondering, have you considered or are you tracking the debt service cost because it's now one of the largest components of the spending line?
It is indeed one one item of expenditure that we are closely tracking because it matches, obviously, very closely interest rate variations. And with the Bank of Canada having increased recently its interest rate once again, this will quite obviously have an upward impact on the debt servicing costs. However, that impact will not be immediate. Well, some of it will be immediate because the government finances itself through treasury bonds or treasury bills, sorry, but also bonds that have various length of maturities. So we will be following the impact on debt servicing costs closely, but we expect this to have an upward impact on debt servicing costs compared to what was laid out in the budget, where I don't think people had anticipated the bank to increase its rate to what it is right now.
And do you recall what the debt servicing cost number is for this year? It's about 40.
Not off the top of my head. It's in the vicinity of $43 billion, I think.
That's right. Just want to thank you for answering that question. Sometimes it's very hard to get answers to factual questions like that, so I appreciate it. It's about $43.9 billion, which is actually quite close to what we're transferring to the provinces for healthcare this year. So that expenditure, any upward revision, is going to make it harder to pay for some social programs, I think. Just want to turn now to some of your other work, everybody's favorite topic, carbon pricing. So you did the fuel charge distributional analysis. You also did the basically the clean fuel standard distributional analysis. Just want to get some impacts on kind of price per liter when it's fully implemented. So the federal carbon charge, or what we're calling the fuel charge, when fully implemented, how much is that per liter?
I think the estimate at this time is that by 2030, when the carbon tax, the price per ton amounts to $170, that will be about 40 cents per liter. I think 41 cents is the number.
Okay. And the clean fuel standard, is that about 17 cents a liter?
Yeah, based on the government's own estimates, it should be about 17 cents per liter for gasoline and 16 cents per liter for diesel.
Right. And if you take those two together and we apply HST, which is what happens at the end of the bill, it's about 61 cents per liter. Is that around right if you're in Ontario?
It's an order of magnitude. I wouldn't add them together personally. There could be some interaction impacts between clean fuel regulations and the carbon tax, but that would be quite close to the number you mentioned.
Okay. And then in terms of the cost to an average family, so think about Ontario for a moment, that's where I'm from, the federal carbon charge, once fully implemented, net cost is about $1,820. Does that sound about right?
Yeah.
Okay. And the clean fuel standard, net cost, once fully implemented, about $495?
Yep.
Okay. Total about just over $2,300 once fully implemented is.
Yeah, for an average household, on average, in Ontario. That sounds about right. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. We spend a fair bit of time arguing about regulation versus carbon pricing versus, other actions the government can take. Most governments are either doing a carbon price or regulations, but our government's chosen to do both. How should we think about the impact that these measures are actually going to have on emissions?
Well, that's a good question. So when we look at the clean fuel regulations, they're expected by the government's own estimate to reduce emissions by 26 million tons of CO2 equivalent in 2030. So that's the stated impact based on the government's own estimate. The carbon tax itself will also have an impact, and I don't remember off the top of my head the exact number, but the point is that whether it's a carbon tax or regulations, both have a cost. It's a matter of how obvious and transparent the cost is.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chambers. Mr. Housefather, please, for 6.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much to Mr. Giroux for being here. So I just wanted to get a better understanding of the difference between the federal government and provinces. So the public sector, for example, has grown considerably. We've heard a lot about it at our committee recently in the last couple of years. Can you please compare this growth to provincial governments and whether the personnel of provincial governments has also grown to a similar extent over COVID and in recent years?
It's an interesting question. Unfortunately, I don't have the answer to that question because my analysis has focused, as it generally does, on the federal government, and I haven't looked at provinces specifically over the period of time.
Okay, I totally understand, and of course, not your job. I just thought, given how much you know, you might know that too. So let me just ask then, perhaps something that you're more familiar with, the complexity of financial statements. For example, the federal government is very complex public accounts. The provinces, I would imagine, have much less complexity. They're much shorter in some cases. They have fewer crown corporations and agencies. Would it be fair to say that the federal, statements, the federal financial statements are far more complex than they are in most of the Canadian provinces? So when we're comparing one to another, they are very different?
Probably a fair statement. However, I would say that when you compare provinces with the federal government, there's a lot of organizations at the federal level, but there's also quite a bit of organizations at the provincial level, school boards, healthcare organizations that can be decentralized in many jurisdictions. So it's true that the overall amount at stake are much lower in most provinces, but whether that means necessarily that the financial affairs of a province are simpler, it's probably a stretch that I'm not myself willing to make. I would rely more on accountants who have worked in both areas to make that determination more clearly or with a higher level of assurance.
Again, fair enough. I was just looking at a statistic that said that the public accounts, for example, for the federal government, are about 2,500 pages. And in the provinces, the average was about 435. So I was just thinking that they would be more complicated. But let me come back to the reason I wanted to do that as a precursor is we had talked a lot in previous years about the time that departmental plans are tabled, the time that financial statements are tabled. As I understand it, since 2015, 16, departmental plans have been tabled on time, no later than March the 10th, aside from 1 year, 2018, 2019, where we had a pilot project. Is tabling the departmental plans in March, is that something that assists you in doing your job? Is that something that is helpful in terms of allowing you and parliamentarians to do scrutiny on the main estimates?
Does help to have departmental plans tabled as early as possible so that parliamentarians and Canadians who are interested can have a better sense of priorities going forward of the various organizations of the federal government, including departments. So it allows them to have a better sense of what the priorities are going forward. So yes, it helps me and my office in doing our work, as well as many committees of the House and of the Senate.
And I think my time is probably coming up. So my last question is, I understand as well that, I've only been a parliamentarian since 2015, but I understand that the financial data that we've seen since 2015 is more than the financial data that was previously part of the departmental plans. Can you advise, is that something that has been useful? Has that helped you do your job?
It's clear that the more details we have as a budget office, the better it is for us to assist you as parliamentarians in your responsibility to hold the government to account and answer your questions. So yes, it definitely helps the more details and the more information we have.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I'm guessing that's 6 minutes.
No, you actually have about a minute left, Mr. Housefather.
Oh, well, thank you so much.
If you wish.
I just used that time to thank Mr. Giroux, and I'll be willing to yield my extra time. Thank you so much, sir.
Thanks, Mr. Housefather. Ms. Vignola, please, for 6.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Giroux, Ms. Vanderlees. I find it very interesting. The tables that you put in the reports are very interesting. They're clear. They're precise. Does the government, in its own disclosures, should it be using tables that are so easy to understand for people who just have a basic sense of mathematics? We want to provide, providing information that's clear and simple to understand is always an advantage for an organization, regardless of who reads them, because it gives better understanding for readers. Thank you, because nowadays when I look at what's being offered as information, it's sometimes confusing, because a list of information without really having any way of having it concentrated and understanding. In the supplementary estimates, I saw $150 million for the acquisition of an emerging treatment for against COVID-19. So that amount is not a lot compared to the billions of dollars in the budget, but I was a bit curious for emergent treatment. So how many people are still dying of COVID? It's 33 people a week, so as much as car accidents and even 1/3 of deaths due to influenza. Have you had the opportunity of asking the government about this figure and what could justify this, given that the pandemic seems to be behind us, but we still have to be careful, take precautions? We don't have that information. We did not look at this detail in the supplementary estimates. Maybe the Minister of Health would have a more satisfactory answer to give you than I can. Thank you. This morning, you also published a report on the investment of $16.3 billion for the Volkswagen plant in St. Thomas, Ontario. How many jobs is this investment creating? Do you have a better memory than I do? According to public statements, the public commitments, the government mentions 3,000 direct jobs related to the manufacturing of batteries for electric vehicles. So it's an investment, if I look at that, of about $11 million per job. My calculations are slightly different. I would say $5 million per job. And the advantages at the end, are they equivalent to level investment, directly and indirectly? We haven't carried that out yet. We wanted to do an analysis with what was disclosed this morning for parliamentarians before the House closes for the summer, rather than giving you a more complex analysis. So the analysis of the economic advantages we will be carrying out over the next few months. There was also an issue of confidentiality related to the documents that we received. Many of the documents are confidential, and we did not want to breach that confidentiality. The analysis had not been completed, but we'll go on with it. But with the multiplier effects that we normally see for such projects, it is still to be determined what assumptions the government used in order to say that the investment will be paid back in 5 years. That seems optimistic to me. In the supplementary estimates, the government adds the addition of $20.5 million. You mentioned that earlier. How do these requests compare to what is presented in supplementary estimates over previous years? And we could take pre-pandemic examples or comparisons. Thank you for your question. I'll be answering in English.
Could find the statistics for budget implementation for previous years. They would not be a reliable comparison due to the difference in the timing of the budget and the supplementary estimates, in addition to the pilot project undertaken by the government in 2018 and 2019. But that being said, we can compare it to last year. Last year in the supplementary estimates A, there was less than 20% of the spending for budget 22 measures for that fiscal year in the supplementary estimates A. So that suggests that the budget 2023 items are a bit more advanced at the time of the budget, or that the government feels the need to proceed with the implementation of budget items this year at a quicker than it did in the previous year.
Thank you very much. Mr. Johns, please go ahead.
I'm really glad that my colleagues have brought up the carbon tax, and I've got some comments and maybe some questions that maybe you can help me with. Now, at $170 per ton, can you tell me about what percentage of households would get a rebate on that?
My understanding is that all households will get a rebate. That's how the system is designed.
Yeah.
The issue is whether they will get a rebate that exceeds what they have paid in carbon tax, directly or indirectly. And my understanding is it varies by province, but the majority of households will get more in rebate than what they pay in income in carbon tax, either directly or indirectly.
Yeah, I believe it was 80% outside
Yes.
of Nova Scotia, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so the 2 out of 10 households that aren't going to get it, they're higher income earners. They can afford to, buy a hybrid or put in a heat pump. That's the idea,
Yeah.
right? Okay, great. Now, I just wanted to clarify, because sometimes we wonder who's fighting for the 2 out of 10 and who's fighting for the 8 out of 10. I'd say I'm arguing to fight for the 8 out of 10 to make sure that they're not picking up the tab. So when we look about, the tab, and I'm going to read this quote from Andrew Coyne here in the Globe Mail, and he had made a comment about your report, and I appreciate your report. But he writes, the alternative to the carbon tax is not nothing, but something else, subsidies and regulations. And the cost of these, as every study shows, costs that are paid not by, quote, the economy or, quote, the big polluters, but by households, is multiple times that of carbon pricing. More to the point, under the alternatives, there are no rebates. Not only are the costs greater than under a carbon tax, but 100% of them fall on households. The rebates are zero. Can you comment on that?
Well, I think that's probably a fair assessment. One example was also the subject of our reports, of one of our reports, the Clean Fuel Regulations, which impose obligations on producers and importers, so they impose obligations which have costs, but there is obviously no rebate that's provided to anybody because the costs are borne by the producers and importers and passed on to the final users, consumers.
Right, so the 8 out of 10 would have picked up the tab, really, more likely than not, in that scenario. Now, in terms of costing of climate emergencies, you did some costing years back, I know that, and you've done it again since. In terms of doing nothing, have you looked at what it would cost for every half-degree increase in global temperature in terms of climate emergencies and the cost to everyday Canadians versus the current mechanism that we have?
So we have not costed doing nothing. What we have costed is, or tried to estimate the impact on the Canadian economy of climate change in 2 scenarios. One, stated policies. So everybody across the world does what they've promised to do and does it on time. And another scenario is countries do what they have done so far and nothing more. And we find that the impact on the economy is, no surprise, greater in a scenario where we do what we are doing, what's currently implemented and nothing more. But that estimate has caveats, big caveats, because it's one of the first serious attempts, or one of the first attempts at estimating the cost of climate change, and it does not factor in potential tipping points where climate exceptional events would become even more frequent, and the cost of these exceptional events. So it's a very first attempt at costing climate change, and it has numbers, but again, it's still something that is in its infancy.
Yeah, I think there was a report in 2013 or 2014 projecting the cost of climate emergencies. We far exceeded what even your office has projected. Have you considered looking at costing, offloading the subsidies and regulations should there be no carbon tax onto everyday people? Have you looked at what that would cost per household versus what they would get back? That way we've got a true idea of that 8 in 10 Canadians that are going to get a return. And if we remove that mechanism, what it would actually cost those 8 in 10 Canadians. Because I think that's a fair analysis, right, to do. And also, I think I'll start with that.
That's quite a start. So, no, we have not looked at such a scenario. We tend to cost issues or items that are being considered or being implemented. There's a wide variety of alternative scenarios that we could cost, but as you can imagine, when it comes to costing the impact of climate change or various types of regulations or taxes, it tends to be complex pretty quickly. So we have to limit ourselves to either the most likely scenario or what is before
I think there's
Parliament.
the do-nothing fantasy land, or there's the subsidies and regulations, which is going to be on everyday Canadians, or the current model, which is that 8 in 10 Canadians get it back, and the 2 out of 10 Canadians that can afford it pay, which they should pay a little more to contribute because they can afford to.
And there's also a scenario where we don't have to do that much. We just have to implement new technologies that will
Right, the 2 in
take
10
off.
buy the hybrid.
That
They
is
save money,
that
they
is
buy
our
a heat
time, I'm
pump.
afraid,
Yeah,
Mr. Johns.
good. Thank you.
Perhaps next round, Mr. Deltel for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. Real pleasure for me to see you back, and especially at this job as a chair of this committee. Monsieur Giroux, bonjour.
Good morning, Mr. Giroux. As I said earlier, it's with great pleasure that I meet you again. We often read what you say, you're often quoted, and we're very happy with the work you're doing, which is neutral and objective, based on facts and figures. And as we say, figures are stubborn. You appeared before the committee on May 8th, and you and your group are very prolific. You've regularly published reports, including the 18th of May 2023, which is a distributive analysis of regulations, of the clean fuel regulations. So that concerns this problem of climate change, which we're all facing, and that the means we must take to fight climate change. We have to say climate change is real, it has an impact on our daily activities. Humans have contributed to it, so humans have to contribute to reduce the effect of climate change by reducing pollution here in Canada, but also everywhere elsewhere in the world. Various countries took differing approaches from those of our government, which put in has implemented the carbon tax. And there's a new approach, which is that of the clean fuel regulations. I'm from Quebec. We know that in Quebec, about 10 years, the National Assembly adopted the system of the carbon exchange. And the government, federal, imposed on all provinces the price of carbon, which is dictated by the exclusive federal will. So with this clean fuel regulations in your report, what impact does this second tax, because it's a second tax, what effect will this regulation on clean fuels, a second tax on Quebec families on average? The clean fuel regulations, we estimate that in Quebec, the average impact will be a net cost per family of about $436 per family in 2030 when that regulation will be in effect. So that's $436 more than what people are paying now. Yes, because it's applied in addition to the carbon tax or to the mechanism used to reduce greenhouse gases, which provinces such as Quebec and BC have decided to implement, which is different from the federal carbon taxing. So if the government decides to impose this second tax? Have you evaluated the effect on the $436, or will it be a tax on the tax and we'd have to add on to the 436? You mean HST? Yes, I think that would be added to the tax, but we're talking about 5%, so it's not a huge amount compared to the $436. But the $436 includes also the economic impacts that the families will feel. What do you mean by that? The decrease of certain economic activities, which will be brought by an increase in fuel costs, which is hard to avoid when one increases sensibly the price of an input as important as gas or diesel. So, for example, the food we're eating, which is transported from the farm to the supermarket and supermarket to our house, the second carbon tax will be applied and will have a direct impact on families. Yes, and that's taken into account in our estimate. Have you evaluated the cost at the gas station per liter? No, we did not evaluate that. The government did and gave us that data, and the government comes to about 17 cents for gas and 16 for diesel in 2030, when the regulation will be fully in effect. And so that's 17 cents more per liter. That's in addition to that first carbon tax. Yes, in jurisdictions where the carbon tax is applicable. So when the carbon pricing is imposed by the federal, if we have a carbon exchange in Quebec or not, it doesn't mean anything. The reason why that regime is not applicable in some provinces, such as Quebec and BC, it's because the Quebec government has judged that it's equivalent to the federal regime. So we could logically think that the impacts on the cost of gas will be generally the same, maybe not exactly the same, but just about the same, in order to get to comparability with the federal regime.
Please.
Thank you, and welcome back to committee. I'm just going to circle back to something that we spoke about the last time you appeared, and it's part of the conversation today. Certainly the costs to the economy, the Canadian economy, from climate change. And I think earlier today it was referenced as an exceptional event, but I would argue that it's probably very much a regular event. I noticed a CBC article, and I'm not using this as an accurate amount, but they said in the article that the BC fires to date are $100 million, and that's before fire season begins. So we know it's a significant number, whether it's that number or not. And that's just one place. We know the fires raged across the country. I referenced before the impact of Hurricane Fiona that we are still trying to work through, and that's in the Atlantic, floods in the past. So there's significant events with huge costs attached to them. How is that cost captured? And is it or are they the cost captured in a way that it's associated to the impact of climate change on our finances, but certainly the economy?
Difficult to capture accurately the costs of these climate events for different reasons. So one, it's difficult to determine with a reasonable level of certainty whether it's due to climate change or whether it's the normal, or which part of it is due to climate change and which part of it is due to regular occurrences or other factors. For example, more human activity in forests, to use that example, as opposed to climate change. And I'm not a climate scientist, so I don't pretend to know. So I rely on experts who know more about climate events. So that's why we have tried to estimate the impact of climate change, relying on internationally recognized studies and relationships between a rise in temperature, which leads to an increase in precipitation and average temperature in Canada, rather than trying to determine which one of the exceptional events is due to climate change.
Yes, thank you. But the actual costs of recovery, let's say, from Hurricane Fiona, or the cost to the the country of the fighting the forest fires. So the actual costs of the weather events or the climate events. How do you capture that?
Again, it's very difficult to capture these. Well, it's relatively easy to capture the cost of these events themselves. What is difficult is to determine whether, with a certain level of certainty, whether they are due to climate change or whether one event is something that would have occurred nonetheless or regardless of climate change. What we know is that the frequency of these events will increase, but whether the costs of recovering from these disasters will be higher or whether we will adapt to mitigate the adverse impacts, and that's a lot of uncertainties for a long period of time.
And so I'm just drilling down on this because when I look at your reports, and they're quite thorough, and I said Hurricane Fiona, which is very close to my home, and we know the costs associated with that weather event are significant. We're in a cycle now where we're seeing more events coming in real time and one after the other. So those costs are part of financial statements. So where would they appear in the financial statements? Because you're not necessarily budgeting for the extent of the weather systems. I mean, I wouldn't believe budget for the forest fires that happened pre-forest fire season. So where would those numbers be carried?
So these numbers to recover and to fight these extreme weather events would be accounted for in provincial books, for example, when it's provincial responsibilities, or with insurers when they have to compensate policyholders for these events, or in the private sector when the costs are absorbed directly.
But sorry, there's significant federal dollars that roll into this.
Yes.
So where's that? Where are those federal dollars? How is that captured?
I don't think that would be in one part. It would be spread across a multitude of departments. Could be fisheries and oceans if they have to repair piers and docks, or public safety, for example. So it's spread across multiple organizations.
Thank you. And so do you...
I'm afraid that is our time.
Thank you.
Ms. Vinola for 2.5 minutes, please.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. So Phoenix is still not working very well. There are informal groups made up, support groups for people who are having difficulties. And 468 million are presented for the renewal of the pay system of the government. How do you explain that amount? Do you have an estimate on the total cost of stabilization and replacement of Phoenix? And do you have the impression that the new program, it's just changing 4 quarters for $1 in terms of costs and in terms of the likely success of the project? Thank you. Last time we looked at the Phoenix pay system in order to estimate its costs was in 2019. So a lot of water has flown under the bridge since then, and a lot of money has flowed as well. And my reaction when I see that there were hundreds of millions, additional millions, to improve the Phoenix system, I was a bit surprised, and I asked the question of the finance department ministers, and so they're saying that it's the last time that it should be repaired. So I share your cynicism, but I must say, yes, I was surprised. Do you have information about the new system, this next-gen system, which is next generation, is maybe not a name of a system? Do you have amounts or ideas about the successive tests that are being carried out currently? No, I don't have any additional updated information about the system that should improve the situation. I'm sorry.
Over to you.
Okay. So, a couple things. In your 2021 report, determined that spending levels were not high enough to meet operation and maintenance costs to provide clean water for First Nations. Have you analyzed the funding levels for clean water programs in the 2023-2024 estimates? And if so, is this enough spending to meet First Nations clean water needs?
Yes, in 2021, we estimated that the capital spending was sufficient, but the operational spending, the operations and maintenance was not sufficient. We have not updated that study since then, unfortunately.
Okay, right now it'd be pretty easy to say it's not sufficient, given what information you have.
It would require a more refined analysis, looking at the number of advisories and the capital expenditures since that report, and whether the government has reallocated some funding from capital to operating.
Okay, there's $2.5 billion that has been requested for the bilateral agreements for the 4 priority areas of the government on mental health, long-term care, health care workers, primary care. Can you talk maybe a little bit about, how that funding will roll out and what, in terms of the needs, like right now, we say that we have universal health care in this country, but when it comes to mental health, we have a 2-tiered system. Most people can't access mental health supports if they want it and when they want it. They usually have to get arrested, actually, to get the help they need when they need it, or go to drastic measures, sadly. Can you talk about what it would take to get to parity with mental and physical health so that people could get access to it? Have you costed out what it would look like for parity for mental and physical health, and also the cost of not doing anything more when it comes to mental health? Because we know it's, I think, $50 billion a year or something like that it costs society.
So we have not costed how much it would cost to provide a certain level of services when it comes to mental health. That's something that we could consider if there was a committee motion to do that. It would be quite an undertaking because we need to have clear parameters as to the expected level of service to be provided by provinces and where the funding would be coming from. And we have not also looked at the alternative, the costs of doing nothing and leaving those who need mental health services and care
Thank you, Mr. Giroux. Perhaps we can get back to the next round. Mr. Johns. Mr. Perkins for 5, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Giroux. I'm going to be asking all my questions about the VW contract. I think I'm probably the only MP here who has actually read it and spent quite a few hours on it. So I would like to start by your analysis and your report this morning on it. It's actually 2 contracts. It's the construction contract, which is from the Strategic Innovation Fund, and then the subsidy contract for the production and the construction contract. Your report this morning was essentially just on the construction part, as I understand it. But by your calculation, there's another $2.8 billion of spending. So that means that the announcement made 3 months ago, when there hasn't even been a shovel in the ground to build this thing, is already 20% over budget. But that being said, the Minister of Finance in a press conference before question period said that you got it wrong, and that she provided you with all the information, but you still got it wrong. And then she ran out of the building, and we haven't seen her since. She wasn't there for question period. So can you comment on that first?
We asked information to the Department of Finance and, the Minister of Finance and her officials, as well as Minister Champagne from Innovation, Science and Economic Development. And I believe we got all the information we were told exists and all the information we requested. And there was nothing in the information package we got that suggested the government had any plans to make that assistance non-taxable. So under current legislation, it's clear that the assistance the government plans on providing, as per the contracts we've seen, as per the statements that have been made publicly, and as per legislation, as I said, that assistance is taxable under Canadian tax legislation. So we verified also with officials from both departments that our interpretation is the correct interpretation. So I am quite confident that the information we got and based on our interpretation of the legislation, that the assistance the government will provide will indeed be taxable. Put that together with the stated aim of the government to ensure that the assistance provided to Volkswagen in Canada will be comparable to what it would receive in the U.S., where it's non-taxable. Putting these two elements together clearly leads us to the conclusion that the amount will be $16.3 billion or very close to that under current parameters. That being said, if the government has plans to amend legislation to make that assistance non-taxable, it's the first time I hear that. That was not information provided to us in our information request.
Thank you, Mr. Giroux. In the contract, every contract the government signs like these has a sort of net benefits to Canada section, presumably for a foreign company that's making an investment in Canada. Is there any out clauses in the contract that allow the parts that will be bought or created to be assembled at this plant to be bought from countries outside of Canada like China? As we know, most of the world's EV anodes and cathodes for EV batteries are made in China, as are most of the critical minerals.
So my office was provided with the contracts, the two contracts, in fact, but it was provided to me with the caveat that it was to be used for our report and not to be discussed publicly because of their commercially sensitive nature. So I don't feel comfortable talking about specific clauses in the contract unless the government itself and Volkswagen tell me that they're fine with me talking about the contract. So I feel bound by the commercially sensitive nature of the contract.
You replied earlier to a previous question that it wasn't $10 billion a job in this subsidy, that it was $5 billion. So your report says 1,400 construction jobs. So if I do the simple math here at the table, that means under the production it's 1,400 jobs. That's how you half that to $5 billion. Is that correct?
We use public number on the number of jobs for the production phase. So the government has stated 3,000 jobs when the production is in full swing, and then there's another
at the
element.
Plant?
Sorry,
3,000 at the plant?
Yes, direct jobs. That's what has been publicly stated.
Just time for one quick one.
Okay. The minister said that at industry committee that the ROI statement comes from the Trillium report, which is a public report. I've searched through it to look for something in reference to Volkswagen. I can't find it. So have you seen any evidence in this that they produced an ROI calculation?
I think, Mr. Giroux, I'm going to have to ask you to respond in Mr. Perkins' next round. Mr. Baines, go ahead, please, for 5.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Giroux and Ms. Van der Wees for joining us today. I'm going to pick up just a little bit of where Mr. Johns left off. In your report, you note that $2.5 billion has been requested to improve health care for Canadians, with one of the areas of focus in provincial, territorial, bilateral agreements for access to mental health and substance abuse services. My question is, how much of this funding is going to British Columbia, Alberta, Ontario, each of the provinces, particularly hit by opioid crisis?
We don't have the provincial breakdown for these additional amounts, unfortunately.
Okay. Since 2015, the government's improved estimates, tagging items in supplementary estimates that have items stemming from a federal budget. Do you believe these changes are helpful?
Yeah, I believe that improves the traceability of funding, and that's helpful in us allowing to provide information to parliamentarians. Yes.
Thank you. And department mandates change constantly to meet the challenges and demands that we're faced with as a government. So the PBO in previous years has been critical that at times the results and targets, both in departmental plans and departmental result reports, have not been measured nor set in a consistent way, which skews the report, doesn't give an accurate picture of the work and achievements of the department. So have any recommendations for how we can keep the reporting more consistent? Do you have any recommendations on that?
I would say that usually setting performance indicators that are consistent over time is a good practice, with the understanding that priorities can change, but the indicators themselves should not change that much from year to year. There should be a relative consistency of performance indicators over time.
Okay, I have a question around the Volkswagen. So the jobs you've indicated make a return after 5 years. Was that?
That's the government's. That's what the government has said.
Okay, so would it have been better to sort of wait to acquire more of that information about the job creation instead of including that in the report right now?
Well, that's the government has indicated that it plans, or it believes that the investment that the government is making, or the spending the government is making towards the construction and production of batteries, will pay for itself over a 5-year period. And we have not verified or calculated this potential return ourselves. We have just looked at the construction phase.
So is there a reason why you chose not to do that work? Is that the reason?
It requires details that we do have, but that could also risk disclosing indirectly the production schedule of Volkswagen. And personally, I wasn't sure if that would be a breach of the confidentiality provisions. But also, even if we were fine with disclosing that, we were running out of time to do that analysis. And that would be conflicting with our aim to provide you with a report before Parliament rises for the summer.
So, again, then long-term benefits of the new plant, it's hard to consider that long-term benefits in the report.
Yeah.
Is that accurate? Okay. How much time do you have, Mr. Chair?
Yeah, 1 minute.
That's all the questions I have for today. Thank you.
Thanks. Mr. Chambers, please.
Chair, appreciated all the questions and the discussion back and forth about the carbon tax. I'll continue on it just for a moment. Farmers or businesses in general don't receive a rebate, correct? And one of the groups that is heavily affected are farms and farmers. And so I appreciate this discussion about, who's really, which families are being impacted. But it seems to me that whether you consider farms as providing a significant subsidy for the funding that happens for the rebates, it's actually quite substantial, including those families who happen to live in rural parts of the country who have, different lifestyle, different impacts, different choices of vehicle, for example. Is that like a fair? Right.
A statement. That's a fair statement of facts.
Right. And I certainly appreciate the trying to quantify the costs of doing nothing, however that would look, in a model. But there's also a point about, like, what's Canada's contribution or pro rata contribution to that cost, right? Which isn't a full, we're not responsible for all of the climate change effects that happen in the world, correct? So, we can't all of a sudden take 100% of the costs and say that we're going to solve it by implementing policies that will affect about, 2% of emissions? Is that?
To one other difficulty, in my opinion, of costing a scenario where we do nothing. whether it's Canada who does nothing and is a free rider and lets other countries do their own emissions reduction, or whether it's the entire world doing nothing, which is a catastrophic scenario. So that leads to various different hypotheses and assumptions. Whether we take Canada as a free rider, in that case, there would be a cost, but it would probably be much more than economic. It would be diplomatic, it would be commercial. So there are various considerations that become very tricky and delicate in estimating a scenario where we do nothing.
The Bank of Canada produced a report last year that said the carbon tax in general added about 0.5 point to inflation. Would it be safe to assume that since the clean fuel standard also impacts the price of fuel and energy, which is one of the more significant contributing components of inflation, that it will be inflationary to some degree?
Yes, to the extent that energy and gasoline and diesel are part of the consumer price index. If you increase one of the components of the CPI, it increases, although marginally, but it increases inflation.
Okay, thank you. I want to pick up on my colleague, Mr. Perkins, just for a minute. We don't know the spending profile for the Volkswagen contract, correct?
Mm-hmm.
We will eventually know the spending profile because it'll show up in the public accounts.
Yes.
Do you have an idea why the government thinks it's commercially sensitive today, but that'll eventually not be commercially sensitive when we will all find out?
No, I don't know. Maybe it's because it involves maybe secrets or commercially sensitive information when it comes to ramping up, or the capacity of a business to ramp up production and then sales of electric vehicles, but I don't know.
Okay. 30 seconds. Quick question. If the government is banning petrol vehicles, what's the point of the carbon tax?
That's a good question. I think it's to reduce the use that would be made of fossil fuels, gas, gasoline, diesel, for cars that will still be on the road, and heating systems and industrial processes.
But over time, with the ban, we would get rid of them.
Of cars, but maybe not of other uses.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Kuzmierczak.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Giroux, for being here once again in front of this committee, and for providing your sage insight, and again sharing the hard work of you and your team. Budget 2023 announced that there would be a reduction in outsourcing. This has been an issue that's captivated this committee for quite some time. And the reduction in outsourcing would be particularly management consultants. I wanted to ask you whether you believe that this is a step in the right direction to provide savings for the public. And as a second question, what considerations, what factors should we as MPs be weighing or looking at to make sure that we get that balance right? Because again, we've heard that obviously in many ways the consultants do bring value, especially when it comes to knowledge exchange, best practices. Just wanted to ask you what considerations should we weigh as we go about, again, finding that balance, reducing outsourcing, but finding that balance.
Question which I didn't expect, and I didn't expect you to be so nice in your preamble by saying that I'm sage. So thank you very much for that. Reductions in outsourcing, I think that should be achievable with some effort, but not like overly difficult, given that there has been an increase over time, especially in the last couple of years, in the use of outsourcing. So I think it is indeed a step in the right direction to use less of these types of expenditures and rely maybe more on the knowledge that's already existing in the public service. And as to what to look for and what to do when it comes to reducing the outsourcing. I would say it's probably outside of my immediate remit, but ensuring that services to populations are not unduly reduced, because some of these consultants are not just management consultants or IT consultants, but there's also service providers for First Nations and Inuit health, for example, rural and remote communities, as well as other types of consultants that are necessary. For example, engineering services for the Canadian Forces, which is maybe in short supply in some specialized areas. So ensuring that the savings do not come at the expense of potentially more expenditures down the road, or poorer outcomes when it comes to health, for example.
Is it also fair to say that obviously this government has a very robust posture, I guess you could say, or a policy program, developing tremendous programs like the Canada Child Benefit, $10 a day child care. We're seeing, for example, the complete revitalization of the industrial heartland, manufacturing heartland in Canada. Very ambitious policy on the part of this government. Just today in the House, we were debating the Canada Disability Benefit, which again is going to, I mean, this is generational. This is historic, that is going to lift millions of Canadians, provide financial security for millions of Canadians, lift hundreds of thousands of persons with disabilities out of poverty. So again, a very ambitious program, one that has tremendous impact on Canadians. Is there a danger that if we cut some of the consulting too much, that it might actually impact on this progressive program, on this robust program of, again, really bringing in tremendous challenges that benefit Canadians? Is there a danger there that it might actually hamper our ability to deliver on those generational programs?
Well, it depends the areas where the consulting services would be cut. What specific type of consulting services would be cut? So if you cut management consultants, I don't think the risk is there. But if you cut, for example, engineering services or healthcare providers for remote communities, or even some IT specialists that are supporting or developing key systems, there could be a risk. However, is there capacity in the public service to replace these consultants? Probably in many of these areas, but not in all of them.
Another question, just changing gears a little bit. We have the benefit as MPs of having your presence here quite frequently to help us understand the budget, estimates, understand numbers and number crunching. A lot of Canadians don't have the benefit of a Mr. Giroux that they can call on to explain, for example, the details of the budget. Are there any recommendations for making the estimates and public accounts a little easier to read or interpret for Canadians looking for information, looking at the budget and the supplements? Is there anything that we could do to make it easier, more accessible for Canadians and MPs to access? To read?
I'm afraid any insight you might have on making it easier will have to wait. The estimates will have to continue to be difficult to understand and cut through. Colleagues, if it's okay with you, there's 2.5 minutes left for the block and NDP. I'll combine the two of them, if that's fine with everyone. Great. Ms. Vignola, for 5 minutes, please.
Merci. Thank you very much, Chair. National defense this week made the headlines. Our soldiers in Latvia have to pay for their own material out of their own pockets. So we also know that national defense does not spend its budgets from one year to the next. So what makes it happen that in the end we have under-equipped soldiers who have to pay out of their own pockets, and a department that doesn't spend the monies that have been allocated to supply these soldiers? Good question, which I can't answer, unfortunately, because this isn't specific example is an example about which I have no information. That being said, the fact that a department does not spend all of the funds planned is not a good thing. Is not necessarily a bad thing. That is, as a taxpayer, I would rather that a department does not spend all the money rather than wasting it. But we think I think that a major department like Defense should be able to spend its money and have a sounder relationship between expenses and provisions. So I should hope that the department will do better with its expenses. Do you know anything about the replacement of the CP 540 Auroras? That's not part of my work plan because there are still some factors that haven't been decided yet. So Trans Mountain. We see there's an explosion of costs going from 12.6 in 2020 to 30.9 billion in 2023. The government of Canada has invested more than $4 billion in the project, and the resale now seems to be impossible without massive losses. What would be the consequences for the taxpayer in the end if Trans Mountain were resold as the project has been planned? Is it normal to be spending so much of taxpayers' money in such a project that has no benefits and direct benefits for Canada at the end? Two things here. The consequence of a sale that we estimate to being normally above the cost of acquisition and expansion, or below the acquisition and expansion cost, risks being a loss. The amount of the loss will be determined according to the price sale when the government sells it. And in terms of the negative effects for taxpayers, the government acquired it to allow easier access to markets for Canadian oil that has no access to export markets other than the U.S., so there could be advantages for producers, a better price for their exported products, because it would be easier to find other buyers than the national buyers and the American refineries. And that's probably one of the reasons that led to the government deciding to buying the pipeline, so that the price of Canadian oil would be higher because of easier exportation possibilities. We see the government that's hiring more and more public servants full-time, 2,300 recently. So we have more than 400,000. So if it's equivalent to about 1% of the population, that's reasonable. We're above the 1%. But do current needs justify this, and what should we be expecting in terms of quality of service and performance with a bit more than 1% of public servants for the entire population? Well, we should expect services that are very, very good with the number of public servants who were hired over the past few years. We went from 342,000 public servants, full-time equivalents, in 15-16 to above 400,000, as you mentioned it, over the end of the last fiscal year. So we should be expecting to have excellent services, but it's not that what we see in all sectors.
So I just want to go back to the carbon tax briefly here. Now, 8 in 10 Canadians would get the carbon tax, get a rebate back. They'd get more than they paid on $170 when we get to the kind of the end, if you want to call it. Can you tell me, like, how much the carbon tax would contribute to inflation?
So, based on a study by the Bank of Canada that one of your colleagues quoted, the bank has estimated that the carbon tax itself contributes about 0.5% to inflation.
Okay. Now, we say we get rid of the carbon tax and, we go towards subsidies and regulations, or try to do nothing. And the U.S. has really made it clear that there would be a border carbon adjustment. What would that look like in terms of implementing that on the 8 of 10 Canadians that would get it back under the current mechanism of a carbon tax versus getting rid of it and having the border carbon adjustment, how would that play in terms of costs on the 8 and 10 that currently get a rebate? And secondly, I imagine that inflation would actually go up significantly more.
Well, it depends exactly what would be done in place of a carbon tax. But if we speak just about a carbon adjustment at the U.S. border, so that would probably lead to economic slowdown, and that could be significant depending on the amount of the adjustment that the U.S. would impose. And it's not unthinkable that if this was to be a significant adjustment, it could lead to significant negative impacts on sectors that are more energy intensive. And we've seen what happens when the U.S. imposes taxes for Canadian exports when it comes to wood products. Like it's been an ongoing dispute for a number of years. So, but it depends on the magnitude of that border adjustment and what type of other instruments would be put in place of a carbon tax.
Yeah, don't I know it? Softwood lumber. I live in Vancouver Island, so the $170 a ton, if that was imposed on, everybody at the border, I imagine that would drive inflation significantly without the rebate.
Well, it would drive inflation in the U.S. up, but in Canada it would probably have the opposite impact. Okay. It would act as a depressor on economic activity and on prices. So right. It would be the opposite impact right. or effect, which is not much better. In fact, it can be, you can say it's worse because it would depress economic activity.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay, thank you for that. Now, in terms of I moved a motion here at the committee to get an idea of the costs of our study on McKinsey. We wanted all documents related to the study. I actually moved a motion to expand the study to include the big six, but without asking for every single document. I was worried about costs associated with that. Can you speak about, your letter to us? You weren't able to get all the data. You cited it's $8 million, just $8.2 million, just at the Translation Bureau, just for, PSPC. Can you give us an idea of what your overall guess would be that the request we made is costing the Canadian taxpayer?
So based on information that I got and short discussions I had with a couple of senior officials, the majority of the costs that they were able to identify were related to the translation of thousands of pages of documents. And they say the other costs would be very diffuse and difficult to pinpoint because they don't tend to track activity by each and every one of their staff members. And this would have required a significant number of hours, but in the absence of a tracking system by activity, they cannot estimate that precisely.
I imagine it would backlog a lot of requests made to those departments, and that's costly on its own. Any recommendations you can make to this committee, given that, my guess is it's tens of millions of dollars. So any recommendations in terms of best practices to this committee on, moving forward so we get the information we need to make good decisions? And secondly, have you seen a committee do this of this magnitude before?
Well, first,
very brief answer, please.
Sorry? I'm not an expert on committee business, but I would suggest or think of one way to limit these types of impacts to having a clear definition or clear request that is as limited as possible as opposed to being wider and that is less subject to interpretation is what I mean.
Thank you very much. Sorry. Mr. Perkins, please, for 5.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Maybe I could let you, Mr. Giroux, answer the question I posed at the end, which is the ROI question. With this $16 billion investment, have you seen an ROI calculation for it, as the Minister claims there is in 5 years? And if not, what would it take to get an ROI on such a large investment?
So the ROI I've seen, or the multiplier effect, as some call it, is 3 to 1 in the current state of the the sector, the industrial sector in Canada, which could rise up to 6-1 if more or the majority of input were to be sourced from Canada. So that would still be considerable at 6-1. And that's based on external estimates when it comes to EVs and batteries.
Thank you. Did you look at the question of the capital cost allowance? So will Volkswagen still be able to use a capital cost allowance deductions with this investment that they're making?
I'm not sure. I don't remember seeing or hearing any public comment, public statement by the government about Volkswagen not being eligible to use CCA capital cost allowance as any other business can. So it's quite possible.
So
that
Reuters has reported that it's a $6 to $7 billion investment they're making in the construction phase of this. A larger part, obviously, would that be considerable? Would it require special legislation for them to not be able to use the capital cost allowance?
Yeah, that's my understanding because like any other business, they're eligible to claim it. So to prevent a specific corporation from claiming the CCA, there would need to be legislative amendments to exclude either that type of business or that corporation itself.
And is that the issue, referring back to your first answer to me earlier about your calculation that this will actually cost $2.8 billion more than the Liberals are estimating, is based on the fact that there hasn't been any legislation passed to make them tax exempt?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. There has been legislation passed, tabled, or even mentioned to this day about exempting Volkswagen from tax on the government assistance that will be provided.
So that's the U.S. Finance Department documents to make this analysis. So it seems to me that perhaps maybe the minister is more confused about what's required to do that than in your report. Earlier, not at this committee meeting, but I think in briefings earlier today, we've all know that Stellantis is in a position where they've said they will walk away, presumably from their investment or the investment under the same strategic investment fund that is financing the construction of that building, and they're asking for a similar deal to what Volkswagen got, which is what I would do too if I were them, in order to ensure a competitive playing field. You, I believe, said that if it comes through at the same level, will probably cost more than this contract. Is that true? I mean, it's hard to know since we haven't seen a contract for either the construction phase or the production phase.
It's very difficult to know because it depends on the production schedule and capacity, because the subsidies are based on a subsidy per unit produced. So it depends on the capacity of that other plant, the Stellantis plant. So in the absence of having any clear idea as to what the production capacity of that plant would be, it's difficult for me to assess whether it would be more or less expensive.
And generally, not in these specific deals, but generally when the government signs a large contract with a private sector company and there's government support for it, there are sort of milestones and metrics, and usually there's conditions that say either party can walk away from the deal or choose to cancel the deal, and Stellantis is saying they're going to walk away from the deal unless they get more. So there must be a cancellation clause then in these contracts in order to allow them to do that, wouldn't there be?
I haven't focused on the cancellation clauses. I focused on the financial metrics. So if there isn't a cancellation clause, we get stuck with the bill of what's been invested already, and they walk away. Okay, thank you.
That's pretty much your time, Mr. Perkins.
Thanks.
Mr. Jawari, please.
And your team, welcome back to the committee, and thank you for the work you're doing. I'm looking at the report that you put on Estimate A. You kind of broken the report into three parts. Around major expenditure. The budget 2023, you talked about the 15 budget measures. tune of about $4.4 billion, and then the indigenous reconciliation, as well as about $700 million on personnel. I'd like to start by the major part of the budget 2023 expenditure, which is about $2.5 billion. And my understanding, based on the report, is that this is the first of the 10 installment of the $25 billion, which the government set aside from the $46.9 billion on shared priorities with the provinces. Can you give us some detail around where that 2.5 is being used, or at least earmarked to be used, and the impact that it's going to have?
These levels were not in the estimates themselves. So on that, I would probably refer to the public statements that the government made when it announced the investments or the additional expenditures on the health transfer and transfers, I should say.
So when you talk about through which the government has announced that it intends to provide $25 billion over 10 years, and then you say, notably, one of the areas that focus in these agreements is improving access to quality of mental health and substance services. So this 2.5 that they have provided, or they're accounting for in this estimate, is specifically focused on the mental health and substance abuse, and what is the positive impact it will have, because you further go down and talk about the opioid crisis, and and you provide the charge. How do you think this $2.5 billion is going to help?
Well, that should contribute to reducing mental health issues, hopefully, and especially those who suffer from addictions, notably to opioids, which is an issue in most regions, if not all regions of the country. So $2.5 billion spread across provinces and territories might not seem a lot, but I think it will certainly help those who suffer from addictions, based on the expertise of public health authorities.
Yeah, thank you. On the personal spending, you're talking about $708 million in budgeting authorities as part of the estimate. And can you tell us where this money is being spent in increase on the personal side, or personnel side? Sorry.
Do you know? Yeah, we don't have these details off the top of our head. We know the amount, but we don't know here. We don't at this moment which specific areas, which departments are going to.
So when you talked about the increase, is actually on the dollar value that you see the increase, but the support document wasn't there for us to be able to figure out where the personnel increase is, in which department, in which ministries, or okay.
No. It's in the document itself, but I don't have the document in front of me. So.
Okay. Any idea, based on having looked at this, where's the major increase, which in the personal area? Is it in government services? Is it in IRCC?
I really don't remember.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
No worries. Well, that's pretty much it. I mean, there's another about $4.9 billion for indigenous services, but the breakdown is quite clear on the report that you put in. So thank you very much. That's all my questions.
Thank you, Mr. Shawari. Ms. Block for 5 minutes, and then Mr. Kusmirchuk for 5.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I join my colleagues in welcoming you here today, both you, Mr. Giroux, and you, Ms. Van der Wees. I appreciate as well the opportunity to ask multiple questions of you, although 5 minutes doesn't give us a lot of time. I do want to follow up on some of the questioning of my colleague, Mr. Chambers, in regards to the carbon tax. And we now have carbon tax number 1, and then we have carbon tax number 2. And I just want to ask you to confirm some numbers for me going forward in regards to the net cost to a household once these taxes are fully implemented. It's my understanding that in Saskatchewan, carbon tax number 1 will cost households $1,723. Carbon tax number 2 will cost $1,117 for a total of $2,840. And that in Alberta, carbon tax number 1 will cost Alberta households $2,773, and carbon tax number 2 is another $1,157. So once fully implemented, that will cost Alberta households over $3,900. Can you confirm those numbers and then confirm if those two numbers are the highest in the country and if in fact Alberta is the highest of all?
I have the numbers for the carbon tax itself in front of me, but the numbers you quoted seem to be accurate based on my recollection. And the clean fuel regulations numbers you quoted are exactly the numbers in our reports. So assuming that the carbon tax numbers are right, which I assume they are, so yes, that would be accurate.
So Saskatchewan and Alberta paying the highest carbon tax per household in the country, with Alberta being the highest.
Due to the economic structure of these two provinces, which rely more on oil and gas sectors than most other jurisdictions in the country.
Okay, thank you. I want to switch gears now and just ask you really quickly about the strong, secure, and engaged strategy. Here in Canada, there's an article today just published stating that the Royal Canadian Air Force could not take part in NATO exercises because essentially our Air Force is up on bricks. And what I'd like to hear from you is if you could give us an update on the spending under strong, secure, and engaged, if there actually is enough money to fulfill the stated objectives of this strategy, and if not, how much more is needed?
So the last time we looked at the spending profile for capital spending under strong, secure, and engaged, we found that there was a delay in getting the money spent by the department. So it led to a reprofile. It didn't start as fast as expected, so they had to reprofile out into the future some of the spending. So that, of course, in the absence of an overall increase, reduces the number of pieces of equipment that the government can buy because the value of money tends to decrease over time. That being said, we don't make assessments as to whether that is enough or not to buy all the equipment that the Canadian Forces say they will buy, because there could be reductions in other types of capital spending, for example, base refurbishments or renovations at bases. So the government could choose to still fund the acquisition it plans to undertake by reducing other areas of capital expenditures.
Thank you. So are you aware, has D&D, changed their plans to take into consideration some of those delays? Have they put forward a plan to meet the obligations as outlined in the strategy?
Not to my knowledge. Last time we released a report on that was more than a year ago, and since then we haven't looked at that. So maybe they did, and we just didn't study that to provide an updated report.
Okay, thank you very much.
Mr. Kuzmierczak.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Before I circle back to my original question about recommendations on how to make it easier for estimates and public accounts on all of us, but all Canadians as well too, I just wanted to take a second to ask you a question on the VW report that you released. I was there this morning, listening very attentively, and I wanted to ask you just a simple question. Have you ever seen, the scale of investment in our auto workers and in manufacturing communities like this one, like the scale of investment in Volkswagen in St. Thomas, and also in Stellantis in Windsor, my hometown. So I'm asking you as someone who grew up in an auto town, who has experienced the ups and downs of the automotive industry, that has seen the dark days of 10 years ago, the displacement, the job loss. Have you seen the scale of investment in our auto workers and auto communities like St. Thomas and Windsor that you studied in your PBO report this morning?
No, I haven't seen anything like that before.
Okay. Simple answer.
Yes.
I appreciate that. Very, very to the point. So going back to my original question, can you just provide us with some recommendations in terms of how can we make the budget and the estimates just more legible, more accessible, again, to us as MPs, but also to all Canadians who want to look into the numbers and want to look at the business of government?
That's, again, a clear question which calls for hopefully a clear answer, but it might be difficult to answer briefly on this one. I think there are many steps that could be taken to achieve the stated objective of making these documents more readable. I think one obvious first step that I mention often is to better align the estimates process with the budget process so that when the estimates, the mains are tabled, we can find budget items more easily rather than tabling the mains before the budget so that the mains don't include what is in the budget. So that would be a very good first step. The other aspect I would recommend is something I try to do myself, but is very difficult, writing in plain language. And it's especially difficult when it's drafted by bureaucrats in various departments that all want to be as precise as possible, but don't have a common culture of writing in plain language. And I'm guilty, and my office is guilty of doing that. So, and having a budget that is tabled at a fixed date or within a short window would certainly allow for better alignment between the mains and the subs. So that would be easier for people like you and your colleagues to hold the government to account and to scrutinize these very important piece of legislation and accountability documents.
Mr. Giroux, as a city councillor on Windsor City Council, we introduced a budget tool mechanism that allows residents to sort of play around or manipulate spending priorities. So, for example, we want to reduce the budget for the police. You would see maybe what impact that would have on the budget, on taxes, and also on services. Is there a tool that's available that could be similarly implemented to allow Canadians to actually play around with and change the budget to what their priorities are, and to see maybe perhaps what impact that's going to have on the quality of service and also the level of taxation and whatnot? Is something like that available out there? I'm just curious.
There's something very similar to what you described available on the very good PBO website, where Canadians and parliamentarians can adjust the tax rates and the tax brackets, including the GST and excise taxes on tobacco and alcohol, if you're interested, and see what it does to the bottom line, the deficit or the surplus. So we haven't gone the extra way of playing with the overall priorities of the government, but that is a very good first step for those of us who are interested, like me, in various elements of policy making.
Is there a way to link that to also service standards or the quality of service as well too? So when you reduce, for example, funding for immigration, let's say, then it shows you what the impact could be on service levels. Is there an ability to connect that to? Just curious if that's.
It'll have to be a very brief answer because we're past time already.
I'm sure there would be a way to do that. Reducing funding for operational expenditures at IRCC would mean delays, lengthening for these types of applications.
Right. Okay. Gotcha. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Giroux, wonderful to have you with us. I think you've been with us so much you've earned a free coffee from us. There's some at the back. You can take it on the way. Ms. Van der East, thanks for being with us as well. Before you leave, you mentioned the SSC report that you did. I'm wondering if that and then the CSC on the frigates that you did for this committee, if you'd be able to update those for us and submit them back to us.
Something we could certainly do. It depends on the timelines you have in mind, but we could certainly consider that.
Colleagues, is there interest to have that just updated and tabled when the PBO has them finished? This is on the SSC that he just mentioned and the one from 2022 for the frigates life cycle costs. Yeah. I don't have a specific date, just when you can get to it.
Mr. Chair, would it be inappropriate? I asked the PBO a question about what it would cost for us to get to parity, with mental and physical health, like just basic mental health supports. Would it be out of order to ask the committee to request the PBO to do a cost analysis of what it would cost for us to get there?
Do you want to maybe put some more details into a motion, and we'll do it Monday?
Happy to do that. Thanks.
Yeah, I think we'll find some time to do it Monday. Mr. Giroux, Ms. Vanderhees, again, thank you for joining us. You are dismissed, colleagues. Before we leave, I have a couple very quick things. One is we have to approve the budget for the SUP-As, which is minimal, but we still have to do this. It's the budget, even though we did not spend anywhere close to this. I need approval for the budget of $1,250 for the SUP-As, which is a working meal and headsets. Do I have approval, colleagues? Wonderful. And then the SUP-As, does the committee wish to vote on the supplementary A's? Yes, great. Shall vote 1A under the Department of Public Works and Government Services carry? On division, wonderful. And that the chair report the vote 1A under Department of Public Works and Government Services to the House.
Sorry, I have PTSD from my last voting experience. On division's fine.
Wonderful. That is all. Colleagues, thank you very much. Mr. Giroux, Ms. Vanderhees, again, thank you very much.
Mr. Chair, can you give us an insight into the Monday and the Wednesday agenda, please?
Monday, sorry, before you leave, colleagues, we're not adjourned. Monday will be the department on the McKinsey. We will have a short discussion with our clerk about the McKinsey documents.
Okay.
And Wednesday, I think Wednesday is the 21st. Wednesday we have open, and I think we said we would do C290.
Okay. That's a firm decision, everybody.
Well, Wednesday, that's always been what the Monday is.
Yep,
the Wednesday fine. We have open. We can certainly discuss
Julie,
it.
I just want to make sure Julie is also aware.
It will be, the 21st is too late for us to get it to the House.
That's fine. I just want to make sure she understands.
Oh, we've had this discussion.
Okay, you've had that discussion with her already? Okay.
And PSIC.
This is why I wanted
Monday
you to...
is the department heads for the McKinsey docs, which have been bumped from other lost meetings.
Okay.
And also bumped for one of the C290 meetings. So that's on to hear from the department heads on their redacted McKinsey docs. And that's this Monday. The witnesses have already been invited. Wednesday is open. We can do C290, but it will be still too late. Even if we finished it, it'd be too late to get it to the House in time. But we did, of course, today in the vote, receive the House's approval to add 30 sitting days. So we can finish it in September or October and get it to the House, as it has been amended.
Et on ne peut pas.
And we can't reverse C280 Monday. So it'd be finished. I think we'd be able to finish it on Monday. So to exchange those.
With that is we've invited the witnesses already, and this would be, I think, the third time for them. So there's that. One of the options, of course, is this was a concern when the original report came up that we tried to table to the House. Mr. John suggested, and I think someone from the Liberal side, why don't we hear from some of the departments of why they are not obeying the rule or order for documents from the committee. We have heard from them. We can hear from a couple others and then report, if we can get support to report the report to the House, as the analysts have done, and then we can get on to C290. But otherwise, it is the department heads on McKinsey, and then the 21st is open. Mr. Housefather has his hand up, and then Mr. Johns.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to just suggest, I think to me the priority should be legislation. And I would think that finishing C290 on Monday and getting it back to the House before the House adjourns for the summer should be the priority. And my recommendation or preference would be to do on the first hour of Monday C290 and try to get it back to the House. I also wanted to raise the issue of the Public Sector Integrity Commissioner, and also suggest that we try to put an hour next week aside to hear from the nominee that's been presented to the committee. So, Mr. Chair, if it was possible to at least try to deal with C290 for an hour on Monday, it would be appreciated. And also, if we could put aside an hour for the nominee, that would also be appreciated. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, Mr. Johns.
Preference is that we do C290 on Monday. I want to get this thing done and to the House and get rolling on it. And so I'm with that. And then I would like to see the commissioner come on Monday if we get done C290, like even if it's half an hour or we stay later and we negotiate and see if we can get the interpreters later. And then Wednesday come back and do the department. I mean, hey, they've been pushed 3 times. They're gonna not. It's not the end of the world if we ask them to come Wednesday. It's Wednesday now. We give them a week's notice. You know, like this isn't like we're doing this Friday afternoon saying we don't want you to come. They work for us, the public servants. So if we say to them, come back Wednesday, I mean, really what they're doing is part of the report anyways, right? Coming here and reporting. So, I mean, that's a conversation. We spent a lot of time on this report. You know, I think C290 should get a priority, you know, given that I don't know how many meetings we've had on McKinsey. We haven't even got started on the study, the other study, the bigger study. So I'd like to see 290 on Monday myself.
Mr. Kuzmirchuk?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, it does appear that we have a majority here of committee members that want to see 290 legislation. Of course, that is the priority. And then PSIC, because that is a statutory requirement of this committee to get this discussion.
Let me just address a couple things before you filibuster out the time.
I'm just saying.
I think we can come to a solution here.
Yeah. But it seems that that's the will that I'm sensing from the committee on both of those.
Well, I can get to that if we can get to it, rather than filibustering. A couple things. If that's the will of the committee, that's fine. I will note a couple things that C290, we have gone well past the amount of meetings we had, mostly because the government has constantly made many, many changes just by promising not to. So I'm sorry, I understand what you're saying, and I appreciate whatever you're saying, but we would have had this done in May if the government had fulfilled its promise and its commitments to that. But we can switch certainly to C290. The issue about the bureaucrats refusing, it's not an issue of McKinsey, they are refusing an order of this committee that the Big Green Book states they have to follow. And that's why, you know, I certainly think we'll certainly do with the will of the committee, and it sounds like it's C290, but I think we should not forget that this is an important thing where the department heads are deciding what the law should be and what rules they should follow, not Parliament. We can certainly take care of it by doing a very quick vote to send the report to the House. I've promised that it's not going to be used as a concurrence or anything else. It'll be a simple report to the House. But if that's the will of the committee, that is fine. The issue of the public sector integrity person, we have options, and one of the options that's provided in the book is, I think it's option C, do nothing. It's not a statutory requirement for us to review OICs. I have spoken with parties about this. There might be a chance on Wednesday for this, but if we want to do C290, then we can do C290. But we will not get through C290 and put aside time for the nominee in the same time, because we still have quite a bit to go. So, Ms. Block? Hopefully.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I know that the time has come for us to determine the path forward. I guess my question would be, what was the purpose of passing a motion in the House today to add 30 sitting days so that we could actually continue to deal with C290 when the House resumes in September?
It was a backup in case, and I'll be blunt, I don't see us getting through it, seeing how long it's taken, but if that's the will of the committee, that is the will of the committee. Mr. Johns?
2 hours on Monday on C290. Let's get through it. Let's do
I'm
this.
saying that's what we wish to do. Then
Let's do it.
We'll bump the bureaucrats.
Okay.
Okay. Mr. Chambers?
I think I'd just point out for the benefit, I don't think they ever want to create a precedent where in the future some department might say, don't worry about sending the documents. Nothing happens to you anyway.
Yeah, well, we've created that in this committee already, unfortunately, and it's for the detriment of Parliament, I can tell you, but that's what the government wishes. So we will do C290 on the Monday, and Wednesday we will move the department heads, and we'll still consider about the public service integrity, the nominee.
Mr. Chair, I have
Sir.
a motion, actually, I'd like to put forward, if that's okay, for a vote.
I don't know if it's matter of hand.
Well, actually, the motion that I'd like to put forward is that the committee continue considering C290 on Monday, June 19th.
I don't think we need a motion.
And provide 1 hour for PSIC as well, too, on Wednesday, June 21st, to hear from the PSIC nominee.
Let's go. Could you repeat it?
We started late, though. We started late.
A couple things, Mr. Smirchuk, I don't think it is in order because we haven't switched to committee business, but I will say if we do that, you're talking about Wednesday to do PSIC or Monday?
So 2 hours of 290 on Monday, and then Wednesday do 1 hour of PSIC.
I would prefer you actually put the motion in writing. We'll do it Monday. I will rule it out of order right now because we're not in committee business. I'd rather we put it in order and do it Monday. We have, I'll be honest, we do have the departments that we're bumping repeatedly. We're only going to get to, we've got 8 departments.
Mr. Chair, we are in committee business, so I would ask for a vote to overrule the chair on that.
Sure. Well, we'll go to a vote whether to overrule the chair.
Court of Division on challenging the chair.
If his motion, if my ruling is overruled, then it becomes a debatable motion. And
Wednesday, the bureaucrats? Yeah, okay.
On finance.
Now let's vote. Vote.
So the question is, shall the chair's decision be sustained?
Yeah.
Okay. Madam Chair, what's the question?
The question is, shall the chair's decision
do
be...
I? The chair is calling the vote. Colleagues, let her, please.
So the question is, shall the chair's decision be sustained? A decision to sustain is the chair. A decision yay would mean the motion is out of order. So shall the chair's decision be sustained? Mr. Jawari?
Nay.
Mr. Baines?
Nay.
Mr. Housefather?
Nay.
I'm sorry, sir. Was that yay or nay?
Nay.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Kazmierczyk.
Nay.
Ms. Thompson.
Nay.
Thank you. Ms. Block.
Yay.
Mr. Kirk.
I vote yes.
Mr. Chambers.
Yes.
Madame Vignola.
Wait.
Mr. Johns. Sorry, was that yay or nay? Yay. Thank you, sir. Just want to make absolutely sure I've got that right. 2, 4, 5. So in the event of a tie, the chair's decision is sustained. Sorry, 5 yeas, 5 nays.
Anyways.
We're doing C92 Monday.
Yep. Yeah. Colleagues, just to confirm, we're doing C290 for 2 hours Monday. But I do need, about 15 minutes to go over McKinsey docs. Okay, so at least 10 minutes from McKinsey docs. I'll try and send out a bit of information in advance so we're ready to talk about what we want to do with the docs. Clear? Colleagues, thanks. We're adjourned.